This isn't your level, Naomi, stop pretending, Linda Graves said, her voice cool and precise, the kind that didn't need to be loud to cut through a room. The classroom fell into a strange, immediate stillness, like someone had pressed pause on every breath at once, 28 students frozen mid-note, mid-blink, mid-thought, all eyes shifting, some curious, some uncomfortable, most silent. Naomi Carter stood beside her desk in the third row, her essay still in Mrs. Graves' hand, the paper slightly bent where it had been gripped too tightly, the fluorescent lights above casting a pale sheen across the white pages as if even the ink itself had been put on trial. Outside the tall windows, a late September breeze moved through the trees lining the parking lot, leaves flickering gold and green, but inside, nothing moved. Naomi didn't reach for the paper. She didn't argue. She didn't even blink right away. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of her desk, nails short, clean, steady, but the smallest tremor passed through them before disappearing again, like a ripple swallowed by still water. Mrs. Graves tilted her head slightly, lips pressed into something that wasn't quite a smile, scanning the first paragraph again as if searching for proof of something she had already decided. Vocabulary like this doesn't just appear overnight, she continued, softer now, but sharper somehow, each word placed carefully. And structure like this, it's inconsistent with your previous work. A chair creaked somewhere in the back. Someone shifted in their seat. Naomi's gaze dropped for half a second, not in shame, not in defeat, but in calculation, then lifted again, meeting the paper, not the teacher, as though the truth mattered more than the person holding it. The clock above the whiteboard ticked once, then again, each second louder than it should have been, stretching the moment thin. Naomi could feel the heat of attention pressing in from every side, the weight of eyes that didn't know what to do with what they were seeing. She thought of the night before, the quiet kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the yellow light pooling over the table where she had written. Line after line, rewriting, refining, choosing every word with care while the rest of the house slept. She thought of her grandmother's voice in the next room, low and steady, reading aloud from an old case file, the rhythm of it familiar, grounding. That same rhythm now echoed faintly in Naomi's chest, steadying her breath. Mrs. Graves exhaled slowly and let the paper fall, not thrown, not slammed, just released, so it drifted down and landed flat on Naomi's desk with a soft, final sound. "You can sit," she said, already turning back toward the board, already moving on, as if the moment had closed. But the silence didn't move with her. It stayed, hanging in the air, thick and unresolved, as Naomi lowered herself into her seat with controlled precision, her back straight, her hands folding neatly over the essay that had just been questioned, her eyes forward, calm, unshaken on the surface, while somewhere deeper, something had already begun to take shape, quiet, patient, and far from finished. The bell did not ring right away, and that made everything feel longer than it should have been, like time itself was hesitating to move forward after what had just happened. Naomi kept her eyes on the front of the room, not on the paper beneath her hands, not on the quiet glances drifting in her direction, but on the faint smudge near the corner of the whiteboard where yesterday's lesson had not been fully erased. Her breathing stayed even, measured, the kind of control that came from practice rather than instinct. Around her, pen slowly resumed moving, pages turned, chairs adjusted, but the rhythm was off, uneven, as if the class had not quite found its way back to normal. Naomi had learned a long time ago that silence could say more than words, and right now, the silence behind her felt heavier than anything that had been spoken. She did not rush to prove anything. She did not look for validation. Instead, she let her fingers slide gently over the edge of her essay, smoothing the crease left by Mrs. Graves' grip, flattening it carefully, almost methodically, as if restoring the paper mattered in a way that went beyond appearances. When the bell finally rang, it cut through the room with a sharp, metallic clarity, and the spell broke all at once. Backpacks zipped. Voices returned in low bursts. Chairs scraped against the tile floor. Students began to file out, some quickly, eager to leave, others slower, lingering just enough to glance back at Naomi before stepping into the hallway. Naomi waited. She always waited. Not out of hesitation, but out of intention, allowing the crowd to thin until the room felt open again, until the air felt like it belonged to her and not to the moment that had just passed. She stood, slid the essay into her folder, and lifted her backpack onto her shoulder in one smooth motion. The strap settled against her collarbone, grounding, familiar. As she walked toward the door, she could feel Mrs. Graves at the front of the room, still organizing papers, still moving with that same precise efficiency, as if nothing unusual had occurred. For a brief second, Naomi paused near the threshold, not turning fully, just enough to let her voice carry without force. "I wrote every word," she said, calm and clear, not defensive, not emotional, just factual, like stating the weather all the time. Mrs. Graves did not look up immediately. When she did, her expression did not change, but something in her posture tightened, subtle, almost invisible, like a thread pulled too taut. "You may believe that," she replied, her tone measured, professional, but edged with something colder beneath. Naomi held that moment for exactly as long as it needed, no longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and stepped into the hallway. The corridor was bright, filled with movement and noise, lockers opening and closing, conversations overlapping, footsteps echoing against polished floors, but Naomi moved through it with quiet focus, her pace steady, her gaze forward. She passed rows of faces that barely noticed her, others that lingered for a second longer than usual, curiosity mixing with something they could not quite name. Outside the building, the afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the pavement, stretching everything just a little thinner, a little sharper. Naomi adjusted the strap on her shoulder and exhaled slowly, the cool air brushing against her skin, grounding her again. By the time she reached the curb where the buses lined up in a long row of yellow, the moment in the classroom had already begun to settle into something else, something quieter, deeper, something that did not need to be seen to exist. And somewhere beneath the surface of her calm, beneath the steady rhythm of her steps and the stillness of her expression, a decision had already been made, not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of something far more enduring, something that did not rush, did not shout, but simply waited for the right moment to be heard. By the time Naomi stepped off the bus, the sun had dipped just low enough to cast a warm amber glow across the quiet street, stretching the shadows of parked cars and maple trees into long, soft lines that moved gently with the breeze. Her shoes made a steady rhythm against the sidewalk, each step measured, unhurried, as if the day had not pressed anything heavy onto her shoulders, as if the moment in that classroom had already been filed away somewhere deeper than memory. The small house at the end of the block came into view, its white paint slightly worn at the edges, the porch light already on even though the sky still held traces of blue. Naomi pushed open the front gate, the hinge giving its usual faint creak, and stepped onto the narrow path leading to the door. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the faint scent of chamomile and old paper, a quiet kind of comfort that settled into the bones more than the senses. In the living room, her grandmother sat in her usual chair by the window, a thick folder open across her lap, glasses resting low on her nose as she traced a line of text with one finger, slow and deliberate. The lamp beside her cast a golden pool of light, catching the silver strands in her hair and the worn edges of the document she had read countless times before. Naomi paused for a moment at the doorway, watching, not wanting to break the rhythm of that stillness. "You are home early," her grandmother said without looking up, her voice calm, steady, as if she had already sensed Naomi's presence the moment the gate opened. Naomi stepped inside, setting her backpack gently against the wall. "Class ended on time," she replied, her tone even, offering nothing more than what was asked. Her grandmother turned a page, the soft rustle filling the space between them, then finally lifted her gaze, eyes sharp despite their warmth, studying Naomi with a quiet attentiveness that missed very little. "And how was your day?" she asked, not casually, not urgently, but with a precision that suggested she already knew there was more beneath the surface. Naomi walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and leaned lightly against the counter, the coolness of the glass grounding in her palm. For a moment, she said nothing, letting the silence stretch just enough to settle her thoughts into something clear. "She said my work was not mine," Naomi answered finally, her voice soft but steady, each word placed carefully, without anger, without hesitation. The room did not react in any obvious way, but something shifted, subtle, like a change in pressure before a storm. Her grandmother closed the folder slowly, removing her glasses and placing them on the table beside her with deliberate care. "Did you respond?" she asked. Naomi shook her head once. I told her the truth, she said. A faint nod followed, almost imperceptible, as if that answer confirmed something already expected. The older woman leaned back slightly, hands resting together, fingers interlaced, her gaze thoughtful, distant for a brief moment, as if reaching back through years of experience, of cases, of voices that had once been dismissed in similar ways. Truth does not always move the room immediately, she said quietly. But it does not disappear either. Naomi stepped closer, placing her empty glass in the sink, the soft clink of it settling into the silence. I know, she replied, her eyes steady, reflecting the same quiet certainty. Her grandmother studied her for another second, then gave a small, knowing look, the kind that carried both understanding and something else beneath it, something sharper, more purposeful. Without another word, she reached for the folder again, flipping it open to a marked page. The paper edges worn but precise, as if they had been handled with intention over many years. Naomi's gaze followed the movement, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if she understood that what had happened in that classroom had not ended when the bell rang, that it had simply shifted into a different space, one where silence would not be the final word. The house grew quieter as evening settled in, the last traces of sunlight fading behind drawn curtains, while the soft hum of a distant television from a neighboring home filled the background like a distant echo. Naomi sat at the small wooden table in the corner of the living room, her notebook open, pen resting between her fingers but not moving, her eyes focused not on the page but on the folder her grandmother had left beside her. It was thicker than it looked at first glance, filled with neatly tabbed sections, each labeled in careful handwriting that spoke of years of discipline and purpose. Naomi reached for it slowly, not out of hesitation but out of respect for what it represented, and opened to the marked page her grandmother had turned to earlier. The paper inside was aged but preserved, the ink still sharp, the language precise, filled with terms that carried weight beyond their definitions. She read silently at first, her eyes moving line by line, absorbing phrases about equal treatment, documented conduct, institutional responsibility, each word forming a structure that felt both unfamiliar and deeply familiar at the same time. Across the room, her grandmother watched without interrupting, her presence steady, allowing Naomi the space to come to her own understanding. Patterns matter, she said after a moment, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the silence with quiet authority. Naomi did not look up immediately, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the page. One moment can be dismissed, her grandmother continued, but repeated behavior, recorded clearly, cannot be ignored. Naomi lifted her gaze then, meeting her grandmother's eyes, and something passed between them that did not need explanation, something built on trust, on history, on a shared understanding of how truth moves when it is given the right shape. She has done this before, Naomi said softly, not as a question but as a realization forming into words. Her grandmother gave a slight nod. Different students. Different details. Same tone. The room fell quiet again, but it was no longer the same kind of silence as before. This one carried direction, intention, a quiet forward motion that could not be easily stopped. Naomi closed the folder halfway, her hand resting on top of it, feeling the texture of the paper beneath her palm. What do I do? She asked, her voice steady, not uncertain, just deliberate. Her grandmother leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the arm of her chair, her expression thoughtful but unwavering. You do not react, she said. You observe. You document. You remain exactly who you are, because that is what will make the truth undeniable. Naomi nodded once, slowly, letting the words settle into place. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her phone, setting it on the table beside the folder, her movements calm, unhurried, as if she had already decided what came next before the question was even asked. And when the time comes? Naomi asked. Her grandmother's gaze did not shift. Then you speak, she replied. And you let the evidence speak with you. Outside, a car passed by, its headlights briefly sweeping across the room before fading into the night, leaving behind a deeper stillness than before. Naomi reopened the folder, this time with a clearer purpose, her eye scanning the lines not just to understand, but to connect, to prepare, to see the shape of something larger than a single classroom moment. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each second as it moved forward, quiet but certain, much like the resolve settling inside her. By the time the night fully took hold, the table in front of her had transformed from a place of routine into something else entirely, a space where silence had turned into strategy, where a single sentence spoken in a classroom had begun to unfold into something far more significant, something that would not remain unseen for long. The next morning arrived with a sharp clarity that felt almost deliberate. The sky stretched wide and pale blue above the school as students filtered in through the front entrance in clusters of conversation and routine. Naomi walked through the doors with the same steady pace as always, her backpack resting evenly against her shoulders, her expression calm, unreadable, as if nothing had shifted beneath the surface, even though everything had. The hallway buzzed with energy, lockers opening and closing, voices overlapping, sneakers squeaking against polished floors, but Naomi moved through it with quiet focus, her attention tuned not to the noise, but to the details that mattered. When she stepped into the classroom, Mrs. Graves was already there, arranging papers on her desk with that same precise efficiency, her posture straight, her movements controlled, as if order itself followed her wherever she stood. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and though nothing was said, something passed between them, something sharper than yesterday, something aware. Naomi took her seat without hesitation, setting her notebook down, her phone placed carefully beside it, screen dark, unnoticed by anyone not looking closely. The lesson began as it always did, structured, deliberate, but there was a tension woven into it now, subtle yet unmistakable, like a string pulled just tight enough to hum beneath every word spoken. Mrs. Graves moved through the material, calling on students, correcting answers, maintaining control of the room. But when her attention shifted toward Naomi, the air changed again, the weight of expectation settling into place. "Naomi," she said, her tone neutral on the surface, "perhaps you can explain the difference between inference and assumption, since you seem to have such a strong command of language." A few students glanced over, curiosity flickering across their faces. Naomi lifted her gaze slowly, meeting the moment without resistance. "An inference is supported by evidence," she replied, her voice calm, steady, each word clear. "An assumption is made without it." The answer hung in the air for a second longer than expected, simple but precise. Mrs. Graves tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing together in that same controlled expression. "Interesting," she said, though her tone carried something colder beneath it. "And yet yesterday, you expected us to believe your work without question." A ripple moved through the room, quiet but present. Naomi did not react outwardly. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of her desk, steady, unmoving. "I did not ask for belief," she said. "Only for fairness." The words settled differently than the others, heavier, grounded. Mrs. Graves turned back toward the board, but the pause before she spoke again stretched just long enough to be noticed. "Fairness," she repeated, almost to herself, before continuing the lesson as if nothing had interrupted it. But the pattern did not end there. Throughout the class, small comments followed, subtle but deliberate, questions framed in a way that isolated, remarks that carried an edge just beneath professionalism, each one adding to something larger, something that could no longer be dismissed as a single moment. Naomi answered when called, her responses measured, precise, never raised in volume, never defensive, each word placed with care, each interaction observed, recorded, held. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time as the tension built in quiet layers, unseen by some, undeniable to others. When the bell finally rang, the release of sound and movement came quickly, students gathering their things, voices returning, the room shifting back into motion. Naomi remained seated for a brief second longer, her gaze steady, her hand brushing lightly against her phone before slipping it back into her bag. As she stood, there was no sign of frustration, no outward reaction to the pattern that had unfolded, only the same calm composure she had carried from the start. But beneath that stillness, everything had been noted, every word, every tone, every pause. And as she walked out of the classroom once again, the quiet certainty within her had only grown stronger, no longer just a response, but a direction, one that was moving forward whether anyone else was ready or not. The afternoon light softened as Naomi stepped out of the school building. the noise of the hallway fading behind her until it became nothing more than a distant echo, replaced by the open quiet of the parking lot and the steady hum of passing cars beyond the gates. She did not rush toward the buses this time. Instead, she turned slightly, moving toward the far side of the campus where a row of old oak trees cast long shadows across a narrow strip of grass that most students ignored. The air there felt different, cooler, calmer, as if the space itself allowed things to slow down. Naomi sat on the low concrete edge bordering the grass, placing her backpack beside her, her hands resting loosely in her lap as she let the stillness settle around her. For a moment, she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in intention, allowing the noise of the day to fall away piece by piece, the sharp edges of each word spoken in the classroom dissolving into something quieter, something she could examine without being pulled by it. The breeze moved gently through the leaves above, creating a soft, rhythmic sound that felt almost like breathing, steady and continuous. Naomi opened her eyes again and looked out toward the empty stretch of field ahead, the sunlight reflecting off the windows of the school building behind her, bright but distant. She reached into her backpack and took out her phone, holding it in her hand without unlocking it right away, her thumb resting lightly against the edge. There was no urgency in her movements, no rush to act, only a quiet awareness of what had already been set into motion. After a few seconds, she unlocked the screen and scrolled slowly, reviewing what had been captured, her expression unchanged, her gaze focused but calm. Each recorded moment was clear, each tone preserved, each pause intact, not exaggerated, not altered, just exactly as it had been. She did not replay them more than once. She did not need to. Instead, she locked the screen again and placed the phone gently back into her bag, her hand lingering there for a brief moment before pulling away. The weight of it was not heavy, but it was real, tangible, a quiet confirmation that what had been spoken would not simply disappear into memory. Naomi leaned back slightly, her shoulders relaxing as she looked up through the branches above, the sky visible in fragments between the leaves, pale blue fading slowly toward evening. There was no anger in her face, no visible frustration, only a deep, steady composure that came from understanding something others had not yet realized. She thought of her grandmother's words, of patterns, of patience, of truth taking shape over time, and the way those words now felt less like advice and more like direction. A group of students passed in the distance, their laughter carrying faintly across the field, unaware of the quiet shift happening just a few yards away. Naomi did not look at them. She remained still, grounded, present in a way that did not demand attention but held its own kind of gravity. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows lengthened, stretching across the grass and touching the edge of her shoes, and in that quiet moment, everything seemed to pause just long enough for something deeper to settle into place. Not a reaction, not a decision made in haste, but a clarity that did not need to be spoken out loud. When Naomi finally stood, lifting her backpack over her shoulder once more, her movements were as steady as they had been all day, but there was a difference now, something subtle but undeniable. She took one last look at the field, at the stillness she had allowed herself, then turned toward the bus line, her steps measured, her direction certain. Behind her, the trees continued to sway gently in the breeze, the sound soft and constant, like a quiet reminder that some things did not need to rush to be powerful, that stillness itself could carry more weight than noise ever could. The next morning did not arrive quietly. It carried a different kind of weight, one that could be felt before anything was even said, before the first bell rang, before the classroom doors fully opened. Naomi stepped onto campus with the same steady pace, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but there was something in the air that had shifted, something unspoken moving beneath the surface of routine. Students gathered in smaller clusters than usual, voices lower, glances more frequent, as if a rumor had already begun to circulate without needing a source. Naomi walked through it without reacting, her focus forward, her steps measured, her presence grounded in a way that did not ask for attention but quietly held it. When she entered the classroom, the difference became clearer. Mrs. Graves stood near her desk, but she was not arranging papers this time. Instead, two unfamiliar figures were present, both dressed in dark, professional attire, their posture composed, their attention sharp. One held a folder, thick and structured, the kind that carried more than just documents. The other stood slightly behind, observing the room with a calm, practiced stillness. The usual morning chatter faded almost instantly as students took their seats, the shift in atmosphere too noticeable to ignore. Naomi moved to her desk as she always did, setting her bag down with quiet precision, her eyes briefly scanning the room before settling forward. She did not look surprised. She did not look uncertain. She simply sat. Mrs. Graves cleared her throat, her voice controlled, but lacking its usual ease. "Class will begin shortly," she said, though her tone suggested that something else had already begun. The woman holding the folder stepped forward then, her presence calm but undeniable. "Before that," she said, her voice steady, professional, "we need a moment." The room went still again, but this time it was different from before. This silence carried anticipation, not confusion. The woman opened the folder slowly, the sound of paper shifting inside it precise and deliberate. "We are here on behalf of a formal complaint," she continued, her gaze directed not at the students, but at Mrs. Graves. "Concerning repeated conduct within this classroom." The words landed without force, but they did not need it. Their weight was already clear. Mrs. Graves straightened slightly, her hands clasping together in front of her, her expression composed but tighter than it had been the day before. "I am not aware of any," she began, but the woman lifted a hand gently, not interrupting with aggression, but with certainty. "You will have the opportunity to respond," she said. "But first, the record must be acknowledged." The second figure stepped forward then, placing a small device on the desk near the front of the room. It was simple, unobtrusive, but its presence shifted everything. With a quiet motion, it was activated. Naomi remained still, her hands resting lightly on her desk, her gaze forward, her breathing steady. The room listened as a familiar voice filled the space, clear, unaltered, unmistakable. Mrs. Graves' words from the day before, from moments earlier, played back exactly as they had been spoken, each tone preserved, each pause intact. No distortion. No exaggeration. Just truth, presented without emotion. The effect was immediate, but not loud. It moved through the room like a slow wave, changing expressions, shifting posture, turning uncertainty into recognition. Mrs. Graves' face did not fall, but something in her composure fractured, subtle, controlled, but visible to those who were paying attention. The recording ended, and the silence that followed was deeper than anything that had come before. The woman closed the folder gently. "This is only a portion of the documented pattern," she said. "There is more." Naomi did not move. She did not look at anyone. She simply sat, exactly as she had from the beginning, her presence unchanged, her stillness carrying more weight now than any reaction ever could. And in that moment, the balance in the room had shifted completely, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more undeniable. Evidence, quiet and clear, had spoken, and there was no longer any space left to ignore it. No one moved right away. The silence after the recording did not feel empty, it felt full, dense, like the air itself had weight. Mrs. Graves remained standing at the front of the room, her posture still upright, her expression composed in form but no longer in control, her fingers tightening slightly where they rested against the edge of her desk. The two officials did not rush the moment. They allowed it to sit, to settle, to be understood without needing explanation. The woman with the folder took a small step forward, her voice calm, measured, carrying clearly across the room without force. "This complaint has been formally filed under district policy and federal guidelines regarding discriminatory conduct and educational equity," she said, each word precise, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. A faint shift moved through the class, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, the quiet realization that what they had witnessed was no longer just a classroom moment, it had become something official, something that extended beyond these walls. Mrs. Graves exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering for the first time, not fully, just enough to break the steady line she had held for so long. "I believe this is being taken out of context," she said, her voice controlled, but softer now, less certain, as if searching for ground that no longer felt stable beneath her. The second official stepped forward, placing a set of documents gently on the desk, aligning them with careful precision. "Context is exactly what has been reviewed," he replied, his tone even, not confrontational, but firm in a way that did not bend. Multiple instances. Multiple days. Consistent language. The words did not rise, but they carried weight that could not be dismissed. Naomi remained seated, her hands resting calmly in front of her, her gaze steady, not fixed on Mrs. Graves, not fixed on the officials, but somewhere slightly ahead, as if she were allowing the moment to unfold without needing to insert herself into it. She did not look victorious. She did not look relieved. She simply looked present. Mrs. Graves straightened again, her shoulders pulling back as if trying to reclaim something that had already shifted beyond reach. "I have always maintained high standards," she said, her tone tightening slightly, a hint of defensiveness surfacing beneath the professionalism. "I expect my students to meet them." The woman with the folder nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. "Standards are not the issue," she said quietly. "Application is." That single word landed differently than the rest, cutting through the remaining space with clarity. A pause followed, longer than the others, allowing the meaning to settle fully into the room. Then, without raising her voice, she continued. "Effective immediately, you are being placed on administrative leave pending full review." The words did not echo, but they carried finality. No one reacted out loud. No gasps, no sudden movements, just a stillness that deepened, as if everyone understood that something irreversible had just occurred. Mrs. Graves did not respond right away. Her gaze moved briefly across the room, not settling on any one person, not lingering long enough to hold anything, before returning to the desk in front of her. For a moment, it seemed as though she might speak again, might attempt to reshape the situation, but the words did not come. Instead, she nodded once, small, controlled, and stepped back slightly, creating a distance that had not existed before. The officials gathered their materials with quiet efficiency, their movements calm, practiced, as if they had done this many times before, though the weight of each instance remained unique. Naomi rose only when the room began to shift again, when the tension started to loosen just enough to allow movement. She lifted her bag onto her shoulder, her action steady, unchanged, her expression calm. As she turned toward the door, she did not look back. She did not need to. Behind her, the classroom remained suspended in a silence that no longer felt uncertain, but resolved, the kind of silence that comes when truth has been heard clearly, and there is nothing left to question. The hallway outside the classroom felt different now, not louder, not quieter, just clearer, as if something that had been invisible before had finally been brought into the light. Naomi walked through it with the same steady pace, her steps measured, her posture relaxed, her presence unchanged, but the way the space responded to her had shifted in a way that did not need to be announced. Conversation softened as she passed, not out of fear but out of awareness, a quiet recognition that something meaningful had taken place, something that reached beyond a single moment or a single room. She did not look for those reactions. She did not slow down to acknowledge them. Instead, she kept her gaze forward, her focus grounded, moving through the corridor as if it were any other day, even though it was not. By the time she reached the front doors, the afternoon light had already begun to settle across the campus, warm and steady, stretching long reflections across the polished floors. Outside, the air carried a soft breeze, the kind that moved gently without urgency, brushing against her skin as she stepped onto the concrete path. She paused there for a moment, not because she needed to, but because the stillness allowed her to feel the full weight of what had just passed without being pulled by it. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even. There was no rush in her expression, no trace of triumph, only a quiet composure that felt deeper now, more rooted. Across the parking lot, the buses lined up in their usual formation, engines idling, doors open, waiting. Students moved toward them in small groups, their voices returning to familiar patterns, laughter mixing with the sound of footsteps and distant traffic. Naomi watched for a second, then began walking again, her pace steady, her direction certain. When she reached the curb, she adjusted the strap of her backpack slightly, a small, habitual motion that grounded her once more in the present. She stepped onto the bus and moved down the aisle, taking her usual seat by the window, placing her bag beside her with care. As the bus doors closed and the engine shifted into motion, she turned her head slightly, looking out at the school building as it slowly began to recede. The windows reflected the sky, bright and open, giving nothing away, holding nothing visible of what had just taken place inside. Naomi's reflection appeared faintly in the glass, layered over the image of the building, her expression calm, her eyes steady. She held that view for a moment, then let it pass, turning her attention forward as the bus pulled away from the curb. The road ahead stretched out in a long, even line, framed by trees that swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves catching the sunlight in quiet flashes. Inside the bus, the noise of conversation rose and fell around her, familiar. Unremarkable, life continuing as it always did. Naomi rested her hand lightly against the cool surface of the window, feeling the subtle vibration of movement beneath her fingertips, a quiet reminder that everything was still in motion, still unfolding. She did not need to say anything. She did not need to explain what had happened. The moment had already spoken in its own way, clear and undeniable. And as the bus moved farther down the road, carrying her away from the place where it had all begun, there was a sense of balance that settled quietly into the space she occupied, not loud, not dramatic, but complete. Outside, the sunlight